Good morning, folks, and welcome. I'm Rick Singleton, Provost of Queen's College, and I'm delighted today to welcome you to our continuing education session on the permanent diaconate, past, present, and future. The session will be presented by our Dean, Reverend Dr. David Bell, who is the lead person in the College of Deacons in the Eastern Diocese. Of course, known to many of us because of his teaching at Memorial University, and of course, even more important, his work here at Queen's College. So, David, great to have you, and thank you for your generosity, both in the role you have at Queen's as Dean and your faithfulness as a deacon here with us in the community, and of course for presenting on just about any topic that can be thrown at you. You'll have something on it, and I'm sure none of us know enough to know whether it's well researched and thought out or coming off the top of your head, but it always sounds wonderful.
I've always worked on that principle.
Well, we won't prove you wrong, at least I won't. So we welcome you all. We especially welcome people who are viewing this as a recorded session. So welcome to you all, and I'll pass it on to the Dean to move into your session, and then eventually we'll come to a point where we'll have our panelists and we'll introduce them at that point.
What I really want to do here is to give you an introduction, which will be followed then by the discussion, by input from other people. But what we need to do, there's no question about it, what we need to do is to bring the diaconate up to date. It's sort of out of date at the moment. And, you know, it's odd because if I were to ask you, those of you who eat meat, that is to say dead animals, if you eat pork, I'm not talking about bacon, which comes from the bacon tree as a vegetable. If you eat pork, you would probably say yes, despite the fact it is, of course, forbidden in the Old Testament. But you would say, but that's the old dispensation, not the new. And then I would ask some of you who are women here, do you go along with the injunctions in 1 Timothy about how you should act when you cut yourself in church? You would probably say no. We don't, because things have changed. And if nowadays you look at the marriage canon, the whole question of same-sex unions, the blessing of them, which myself and my colleague Michelle Revy do in fact present a paper on from Queen's College, again, things have changed. They've changed dramatically. And the priest today is not the same as a priest as a priest was as in the days when he, the man in black, was 20 years ago. Things have changed dramatically. They have not changed in the same way in the diaconate. And the diaconate needs to be dragged, protesting and screaming, back into, right up into the 21st century. What I've tried to do here in a paper which I was asked to do by Alex, is to present a really brief version of it, is to present as if a new and updated view of the diaconate. And whether we call it, what we're going to call it, I'll mention in just a moment. The provost is mentioned as the perpetual or permanent diaconate. If I may, I would suggest that is an unwise title. One, because none of us is perpetual, and two, because you never know what's going to happen. For myself, for example, I managed to escape God for 50 years. Jonah had nothing on me, but he got me in the end. And as a deacon, but it's my vocation as a deacon. But it may happen that God will demand that I become a priest. I'm not intending to do that, I keep my head down, or it may happen that a bishop makes you an offer you can't refuse, you know, otherwise you wake up in the morning with a horse's head in your bed, and then other things happen. So I would suggest, myself personally, I would suggest that the best title is vocational deacon and the vocational diaconate, rather than perpetual or permanent, because it may not be perpetual, it may not be permanent, but it is certainly vocational. There's no question about that. And that's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it. And you bear in mind, of course, we may bear in mind that a vocation may or may not change over a period of years. Now, the history of the diaconate is interesting. The history of the diaconate is, of course, traditionally traced to Acts 6, as you know. When I say everybody knows, when I say, who was the first deacon, and you all pipe up. You all pipe up. He's never called a deacon. There's nowhere in the New Testament that Stephen is called a deacon. There's nowhere in the New Testament, the only other one of those 7 who is mentioned again is Philip. He's not called a deacon either.
How about
Phoebe, no. I'm talking about the 7. I'm talking about the 7. We have others who are mentioned as deacons, but Steve is not one of them. We have Epaphras, we have Tychicus, we have Phoebe, and others, both men and women deacons. But interesting enough, Stephen is never called a deacon, and Philip is never called a deacon. So Stephen as the first deacon is actually Stephen as the first something. Yeah. So we look therefore at what in fact he did. And what he did, in fact, of course, and the other 7 were, the other 6 were to help the apostles, whose business was prayer and the ministry of the word, in feeding the widows of Hellenistic Jews. If therefore we were to be strictly biblical, then we would be, all our business would be to feed the widows of Hellenistic Jews. There are not many widows of Hellenistic Jews here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And our job, therefore, will be fairly limited. But what tends to happen is we tend to look back to the New Testament and say, what did these deacons do? And if you have the word deacon, diaconos, deacon, in the New Testament, we have plenty of information on the demands of what a deacon's character should be. There's quite a lot about that. But hardly anything on what they're supposed to do. Why not? I think I can tell you. There are 3 important verbs, and they're all 3 important words, all affecting the same thing. They're all Greek, but they come into English perfectly easily. Diakonos, deacon, and the word which looks like in English, deacon-o, to deacon, and then the word deacon-ear, deaconing. All 3 are exactly the same. Deacon with an OS on the end, deacon with an O on the end, deacon with IA on the end. Same thing. If we look through the New Testament for the verb and those words, not just deacon, but the word to deacon and the verb deaconing, they occur more than 100 times. And what becomes clear then, for example, when Paul in 1 Corinthians and Romans says there are various kinds of service, you remember, and then list them. The word for service is diaconia. So what he's saying is there are various kinds of deaconing. And if you look through the pages of the New Testament, it's not a bad thing to do on the whole. It has some quite good stuff in it, here and there. But if you look through it, you'll find that effectively serving was dependent entirely upon the situation and what needed to be done, in much the same way as in this city, St. John's, we have people who serve us by picking up our garbage, thank God, and we have people who serve us, the mayor and the councillors, by supposedly looking after the city. We have the postal workers, the federal government, who serve us by delivering mail to community mailboxes, which is a sin against the Holy Ghost. But apart from that, so in other words, service depends on the circumstances. The provost served this college by administering it and telling his dean what to do. The students serve this college in a multitude of ways. Service, therefore, is not one thing or two things. It depends upon the circumstances, and it depends upon, of course, the qualifications of the person involved. This is what a deacon was in the New Testament. They did all sorts of things. Depending on what was necessary at the time and the place. Stephen and the other 6, who are not called deacons, I say again, did what was necessary at that time in that place. It is therefore foolish of us just to look back and say, oh, that's what Stephen, who was not a deacon, did, and therefore that's the only thing that we should do. Times have changed, things have changed, and we must change with a 21st century deacon. A 21st century deacon should be ready to do whatever is necessary to be done in order to assist both his or her presbyter and his or her bishop. More about that in a moment. We have no idea really what these people called deacons, like Phoebe, like Tychicus, like Epaphras in the New Testament did. There was no order of deacons at that time. The church was in, at that time, too volatile a situation. It was in too fluid a situation. Nothing had been defined yet. Nothing had been refined. We don't even have any, it's not even clear what a presbyter, presbyteros, a presbyter, an elder, the term it comes later on as to priest. But it's most unwise to talk about priests in the New Testament period. Things have not yet developed that far. The threefold ministry as bishop, priest, and deacon, which we all know about nowadays, is essentially a product not of the 1st century, but of the early 2nd century. The early 2nd century. That's when we see it coming into being. It was preceded by, indeed, a different scheme, but a quite different scheme. In the New Testament, the period of, in fact, of Stephen and the others, we have a threefold scheme of apostles, prophets, and teachers. They're all mentioned by St. Paul. Apostles, prophets, and teachers. But by the end of the 1st century, you see, at the beginning of the 2nd century, the apostles are dying out. They're dying out. And by the beginning of the 2nd century, by say 120 or so, none of them are left. None of them are left. The prophets by this time have been silenced, subtly silenced, because the church didn't like them, didn't trust them. The church, all the churches, have never liked prophecy, because you never know what a prophet's going to say. You can't control them. Huh? You don't know what's going to come out of their mouths. So for Paul, prophecy was in fact one of the deaconings, one of the diaconal, one of the services which people could do. There are various deaconings. Prophecy is one of them. But by the early 2nd century, the church had looked askance on this and had effectively silenced the prophets. Some of the last ones founded a heretical sect, which some of you may have come across, called Montanism. But that was about the last of it. That was about the last of it. What was left were the teachers. And the teachers, those who proclaimed and interpreted the word, were those who became the bishops and the presbyters and the deacons of the new dispensation. Now, the diaconate flourished from the early 2nd century, when we first really see it clearly, to the early 4th century. And indeed, in that period, over a couple of centuries there, a little more than a couple of centuries, there were times and places in which the deacons were regarded as the bishop's agents or the bishop's delegates, and they occupied a more significant place than the presbyters. They were more important than the presbyters, and they had more power than the presbyters. But what happened then? So what happened? Well, in the course of the 2nd century, we get the development of what is called, in technical theological jargon, the monarchical episcopate. What that means is simply that bishops changed. They changed from being overseers of what were local churches, which is the very earliest bishops were. A bishop, episcopos, simply means overseer. But they changed from being overseers of a local church, or maybe two local churches, to overseers of a diocese. And then they administered the diocese as a monarch, as a ruler in the diocese, which is what the doctrine of the monarchical episcopate means. In other words, a bishop was ruler of a diocese and not just the overseer of a local church. Now, once that had happened, and it happened by about, we start to see it happening by about 200 to around about 180, 190, 200, around about 200, say. By about that time, so too as the monarchical episcopate developed, so the position of deacons changed. Because what happened is that when the bishops started to be concerned with much greater areas, dioceses, so the local presbyter took over the local church and then became, in fact, the administrator of the local church. So then the deacons, who formerly had been the bishop's agents when the bishops were looking after the local churches, now became the presbyter's agents when the presbyters were looking after the local churches. You see the change in what happened? So that instead of being the bishop's agents, now the deacons became effectively assistants to the parish clergy. So that by about the 300s, and especially by the late 300s, they could be referred to, as St. Jerome refers to them, for example, as being inferior to the order of presbyters. That was never the case early on, when they were either regarded as being equal to the presbyter, working with the presbyter as an essential part of the presbyteral ministry, or even more important than the presbyter, since they were responsible to the bishop. That changed once the bishop's role had changed and once the presbyter had taken over what the bishops were earlier doing. You with me on that? If you are, grunt, then I'll know whether you're following me. I want to hear, okay, that's important. And then, over the ensuing centuries, let's say from about 400 AD onwards, the position of the deacons continued to decline, though much more in the West than in the East. Now, as some of you know, as some of you may not know, I was Orthodox for 40-odd years. I was baptized Anglican, changed to Orthodoxy when I was in my 20s, and I was Orthodox until 3 or 4 years ago, whatever. And then I was ordained as an Orthodox subdeacon. We still have them in the Orthodox Church, and it's not just set aside as a subdeacon. You're actually ordained I was ordained by the Archbishop and tonsured the whole thing, and I was ordained as a subdeacon, and so I became an Orthodox subdeacon. And as an Orthodox subdeacon here in St. John's with my colleague, we were 2 subdeacons. We were running an Orthodox parish, a multilingual, multicultural Orthodox parish, for about 9 years, about 9 years before the present parish, the present Orthodox priest came along. As such, we had, as I said to Emeline earlier, there were only 2 of us as subdeacons, but to run the place we had no option but to do deacons' work as well. And what is clear in the Orthodox Church especially is the deacon still does a huge amount. He's still regarded as a member of the senior clergy, and apart from various parochial duties, he plays a really major role in the divine liturgy. In fact, in the Orthodox Church, I don't know how many of you ever attend an Orthodox service, if there's a priest and a deacon there, you'll find that the deacon is doing almost everything. The only thing the priest does is pray behind the altar. He doesn't even distribute the bread and wine. He is behind the altar. He prays. That's his business, and his business is to consecrate the sacred the hosts, the bread and the wine, the materials for the Eucharist. And apart from that, the deacon is doing everything. He sings the liturgy, always he in the Orthodox Church. He sings the liturgy, he does the prayers, the whole shooting match is done by the deacon. They play a really, really, really major role in the Orthodox tradition. They always have done, and they still do so. Now, this was not the case in the West, because in the West, the role of the deacons became less and less and less. The diaconate became more and more and more unimportant. And by the mid-20th century, by the 1940s, 50s, the diaconate in the West had, to all intents and purposes, disappeared. If there were deacons, they were university transitional deacons or just regarded as apprentice priests. And deacons, per se, played no other role, effectively, in the West than reading the gospel. And even that role was often taken over, often subsumed by the priests. They really had no significant place or role to play. Now, the first great change in modern times came not with the Orthodox Church, which moves at the speed of an arthritic tortoise. It certainly didn't come with the Anglican Church, which dithered, as it has always dithered. It came with the Roman Catholic Church, and with that remarkable Pope, John the 23rd, and with that incredibly important and spirit-filled council, the Second Vatican Council. You want to get inspired as what Christianity is all about, read the documents which came from Vatican II. Just superb stuff. That was in 1962 to 65. And one of the most important constitutions, one of the most brilliant constitutions in my view, which came from that council, the Constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, promulgated in 1964, that constitution called for the restoration of the diaconate as, I use the term used in that document, permanent, I mean vocation, but as a permanent vocation open to married men. Now, there had in fact been an earlier call for the restoration of a diaconate open to married men, note, and that was at the Council of Trent in the 16th century. That was the council called by the Catholic Church as an attempt to dam the tidal flow, the tsunami of the Protestant Reformation. It did not, of course, succeed, and the call for the restoration of the permanent diaconate at the Council of Trent came to nothing. Nothing whatever happened at all. But the call from the Second Vatican Council in the Constitution of the Church was approved by the Pope at the time. That was Pope Paul VI, remarkable Pope before he got scared and dominated by the conservative elements in the Curia. And indeed, the permanent diaconate was reinstated. And it proved immensely successful. There were problems. They proved immensely successful. And I found that in 2014, just 2 years ago, there were some 18,700 or so permanent deacons in the Roman Catholic Church in the United States. I don't know about the Canadian numbers. And of these, 93%, in fact, were married. There are problems, or at least I think there are problems, inasmuch as it seems illogical to me to be able to bring in married men and offer them the diaconate, whereas in fact priests who have left the priesthood, sometimes get married in earlier days, are not in fact offered the same thing. But that's something which the Roman Catholic Church can have to worry about, and it's not in my purview, which is great. I leave that to Paul Lundrigan. What did the Anglican Communion do? As I said to you before, the Anglican Communion did this. This is not something unknown in the Anglican Communion. The Anglican Communion has brought dithering to an art form. You know, it sits on the fence. It sits on the fence so long that, you know, the fence has got up to about its throat. You know, there's no question about this. On the other hand, the Anglican Communion has the courage of taking up things like same-sex relationships and examining it carefully and going ahead with it. The Anglican Communion has, when it's good, the Anglican Communion is very much like the girl with the curl in the middle of the forehead. When it's good, it's very, very good. And when it's bad, in this way, it can be useless. But it has that potential. It's one of the reasons why I love it, and I come back to it. The Lambeth Conference in 1958 expressed, as you would expect in wishy-washy terms, that the restoration of the diaconate as a distinctive order in the Church of God might be a good thing. But little came of the recommendation. And over the next 40 years, from 1950, I say 1960 to 2000, over the next 40 years, various Anglican statements became somewhat more definite, although they were always hedged about with caution. And the inertia demonstrated by the Anglican Communion stood, and in fact still stands, in marked contrast to the attitude of the Episcopalian Church in the United States, which early on embraced the principle of the restored diaconate and embraced it ardently and willingly. In the US, I know this especially because I have some of my great friends down there are deacons, vocational deacons, and I myself am a sort of honorary vocational deacon in the Cathedral Church in Burlington. And I know their business, I know how they work. And vocational deacons are recognized as belonging to a distinctive order with its own theology, its own duties, its own responsibilities. Deacons are important. They're not merely an offshoot of the lay ministry, more about that in a minute, and they're not a collection sort of priest manqué, priests who should want to be priests but didn't quite make it for various reasons. They are people in their own right. The Church of England, not the Anglican Church in Canada, the Church in Canada I'll come on to in a moment. The Church of England didn't do nearly so well. And one of the reasons for that, as Neil will know, is that there was a very strong and organized lay readership in the Church of England in England. A very strong voice of an organized lay readership. And they saw deacons as the restored vocational diaconate as encroaching upon their territory. And they didn't want this at all. And they were, as I said, their voice was extremely strong, extremely well organized, extremely powerful. And the Church of England really didn't know what to do. It didn't know what to do. In fact, the Church was faced with the problem of an organized lay ministry on the one hand, who saw a restored diaconate as treading on their toes and taking over what they've been doing since the flood. And on the other hand, priests who saw a restored diaconate as dogs are snapping at the priestly heels and taking over what in fact should be theirs by right because they were priests and priests are priests. In other words, they suffer from that sort of inherited participated infallibility, which priests sometimes do tend to suffer from. Bishops suffer from it even more. The only person who doesn't suffer from it is Pope Francis. So the church really didn't know what to do. And in 1974, it's not all that long ago, 4 years after I came over here to this blessed island, 74, it actually recommended abolishing the diaconate, abolishing the diaconate on the grounds that whatever it could do, whatever the diaconate could do, could be done just as well by priests and the lay ministry. That was the Church of England in 1974. Happily, the recommendation was not followed. But between 1974 and about the year 2000, vocational deacons in the Church of England became effectively invisible. They existed in theory, but the church had no idea what to do with them. And to be quite honest, in fact, despite some important documents released between 2001 and 2007, it still doesn't know what to do with them. One of the problems we face here in Canada, here in Newfoundland, here in St. John's, is the fact that we have a number of vocational deacons, one minute, but not all that many priests have any idea really what they can do or how to use them or what to do with them. That's one of the main problems. Anyway, the Anglican Church of Canada did rather better than the Church of England, but not nearly so well as the Episcopal Church in the USA. The first series of ordinations to the vocational diaconate took place in Western Canada, not here, Western Canada in the 1970s and early 80s. In fact, east of Quebec, nothing happened east of Quebec, nothing at all. But in the 70s and early 80s, there were ordinations in the vocational diaconate, but the movement faltered, halted, and fizzled out. And there were three problems. There were three reasons for this, all of which are fairly clear. The programs were instituted effectively by individual bishops. They were not part of an overall policy of the Anglican Church in Canada. They were instituted on an ad hoc basis at the decision of individual bishops. Here, this bishop would like it, this bishop didn't, and so that way, that was not, of course, a good way. They were not, secondly, they were not established on a solid foundation of education and training, to which I'll refer later. In other words, there was no provision made for organized training and organized education of these new vocational deacons. They were sort of left on their own, and so they sort of just drifted away. And thirdly, the local presbytery, the local priests, tended to view these new vocational deacons either with apathy or hearty dislike, seeing them once again as unruly curs snapping at the heels of thoroughbred dogs. So it faded away. And then there was a second series of ordinations which began in the mid-1990s. And that was much more successful, not least because it learned a very great deal from the successes of the Episcopalian Church in the United States, vocational diaconate in the United States. And the programs were instituted after appropriate consultation, and there were education and training programs which were grounded in good, solid theology. Those are much more successful. And the first Canadian Conference of Deacons, the very first Canadian Conference of Deacons, was held in Winnipeg in the year 2000, just 17 years ago. And of our province, only one diocese was represented, and that's our own diocese, the Diocese of Eastern Newfoundland and Labrador. No one represented Central, no one represented West. And the conference resolved, what that conference resolved to do was to form an association of Canadian deacons, in a similar way to what already existed in the United States. At that time, it was called the North American Association for the Diaconate. It's the same principle. In other words, a formal organization to which deacons could belong. And this worked. This worked. Such an association was formed. It was called the Association of Anglican Deacons in Canada, known as the AADC. And the most recent conference of the AADC, the Association of Anglican Deacons in Canada, was held in Halifax just 3 years ago in 2014. And by that time, by that date in 2014, our diocese, the Diocese of Eastern Newfoundland and Labrador, had a flourishing diaconal program with 21 deacons, 21 vocational deacons. That was in 2014. I don't know what the total is now, of whom one was retired. And this placed our diocese, in fact, in the fourth place of all 31 Canadian dioceses. We were doing pretty well. Toronto led the way. This is in 2014. Toronto led the way with 45 deacons, and of whom 12 were retired, I might add. And the diocese of Central Newfoundland and the diocese of Western Newfoundland were at the very bottom of the list. Central had 1 vocational deacon and the West had 2 vocational deacons. Things have changed since. Now, what is a deacon? The standard translation, of course, is servant, and that's fine. But don't think of servant as slave. Think of servant as anyone who serves. And as I mentioned to you earlier, we serve in all possible ways. Indeed, a deacon is a representative of the true and real and perfect servanthood, perfectly exemplified in Christ himself. And in his image, in the servant ministry, the deacon is the representative of a servant ministry to which all Christians are called as a consequence of their baptism. All Christians are baptized to serve, to deacon, if you like. It is a service which, of course, is ultimately perfect freedom. A man called John Collins in recent years, starting about 1990, produced a number of books, extraordinarily important books, in which he demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt, I mean beyond any doubt whatsoever, that the old idea as a servant primarily concerned, let us say, with social work, as a deacon, as someone concerned only with sort of visiting people, unless I'm just probably making up, visiting people in hospital, attending to the things, attending to social matters which the priest may not have time to deal with. That is inaccurate and far too limited. What he does, John N. Collins, is to examine the use of the word deacon and deaconing to deacon in the New Testament and put forth a far, far, far more comprehensive, far richer, far more important, far more demanding role of the deacon, which had hitherto been expressed. That was in the first of his books published in 1990, which he called Diaconia, Reinterpreting the Ancient Sources, a most excellent piece of work published by Oxford University Press in 1990. Absolutely essential reading and a brilliant piece of work. But it totally revises the idea of the deacon as a presbyter's servant. And he reminds us that in the early church, as I mentioned to you, the deacon was not the priest's servant. He was in fact the bishop's agent, And his responsibilities, the responsibilities of the deacon in the early church and the responsibilities of the deacon as they should be now are liturgical, and they are instructional, and they are pastoral. All three things. The business of the deacon is to proclaim the gospel, but you can't proclaim the gospel without understanding what the gospel is proclaiming. You've got to understand it. You have to have training, you have to have that basic education. In other words, John Collins shows two things, one which is good, one which is bad. One, he shows that the role of the deacon is far wider, far more important, far greater than most people suspect, And the bad side is that deacons therefore have to be trained far better than they are being trained in order to encompass this enlarged view, this enlarged vision of what the diaconate is. Now, a Roman Catholic document issued in 1988, which was called the Basic Norms for the Formation of Penitent Deacons, stated that the ministry of a deacon is characterized by the exercise of three offices. Four will recognize the three munera, three offices. One, the office of teaching, and I quote, by which the deacon is called to proclaim the scriptures and instruct and exhort the people. That's absolutely essential. Not just to proclaim, but to instruct and exhort the people. Two, the office of sanctifying, which is expressed in prayer and in the deacon's participation in the celebration of the Eucharist. And the document states that the deacon's business with the Eucharist, the deacon's role in the Eucharist, is central to the identity of what a deacon is. It's not defined by social work, it's defined by the deacon's role in not assisting, but in cooperating, co-working with the priest in the celebration of the central sacrament of the Christian religion. And also in the rites, as the document says, of baptism, marriage, of death, and of burial. And then, if I may quote the document itself, this brings out how the diaconal ministry has its point of departure and arrival in the Eucharist and cannot be reduced to simple social service. And the third of the offices is the office of administration, which is exercised, I quote, in dedication to works of charity and assistance in the direction of communities or sectors of church life, especially as regards charitable activities. Fair enough. And that's what we can see in the page of the New Testament. Deacons were obviously not just feeding widows of Hellenized Jews, they were obviously administering large areas. They were obviously the budget people for some areas. They were looking after the church. Why? Because the business of the apostles was, as the apostles said, to pray and to proclaim. And the business was prayer and the ministry of the word. We're not yet into, of course, the organization of the Eucharist, etc., etc., etc. Not all of these three offices will be exercised in the same extent in all places and at all times. On the contrary, just as in the New Testament, what the deacon does in these three offices, the office of teaching, the office of sanctifying, the office of administration, it must be determined by the different pastoral situations, the different parochial situations of individual churches as determined by the diocesan bishop. So what a deacon does must inevitably be dependent upon what a deacon is qualified to do. In the days of St. Stephen, for example, who was not a deacon, there weren't too many MBAs. They were very thin on the ground. And the development of a real Christian theology had hardly begun. Christian theology really begins toward the end of the first century with the input and the influence of Greek philosophy. I might say, for example, I used to say to my students on the other side of the road, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is 80% Greek philosophy and 20% New Testament. It's absolutely true. But it hadn't really started. Over the next 2 or 3 centuries, of course, things develop, and they develop very rapidly. Christianity, there were, in fact, at this time, not just one Christianity, there were a number of competing Christianities, alternative Christianities, some of which were the Gnostic sects, you may have heard of them, which were extremely popular, extremely. They were regarded as the greatest danger by some Christians in the Christian church. But things were a hotbed, a ferment of change, and it was a very considerable time before an organized, formal Christian theology of, first of all, the Trinity was developed, an organized Christian theology of the person of Christ, an organized Christian theology of the sacraments, an organized Christianity, an organized theology of the church. It took centuries. It took centuries, between about 300 and 500, no more, yeah, about 300 and 500 years for these doctrines, these theologies to be developed in a concrete way. It took a long time. So what a diocesan bishop needs to do is to realize and to recognize that he or she must accommodate the circumstances and use the deacons appropriately. If a deacon is well qualified in, for example, nursing, as Derek is here, then we make use of that particular talent. If a deacon has some qualification in theology, as for example I have myself, then we'll use it in that way. And so on for other places, for other people in other areas. Someone who has a basic high school education will have things to offer, obviously things to offer, but they're going to be things to offer which are different from someone, let us say, with a bachelor's degree in journalism, or someone with an MBA, or someone with a doctorate in social services, or someone with professional expertise in, say, fundraising, or professional expertise in networking, or professional expertise in the problems of dealing with drug addiction, for example. In other words, although the BAS, the Book of Alternative Services, states that, quote, there are deacons who, in addition to assisting bishops and priests in all this work, have a responsibility to minister in Christ's name to the poor, the sick, the suffering, and the helpless. This should be regarded as inclusive rather than exclusive. In other words, it's not just what they do, it may be part of what they do. And it may not be part of what they do in some cases. Because the worst thing you could have, sometimes the most destructive thing you have, is some deacon doing amateur psychological intervention. It is most unwise. Rick knows beyond anyone how dangerous it can be to have someone who does not know what Greek counseling is all about to try to take it on. It can be an absolute unmitigated disaster for all parties, So in these days, in 2017, what the deacon may be called to do must depend on his or her education, his or her training, his or her abilities, their age, life experience, employment, contacts, and so on, and the precise day-to-day circumstances of the parish or parishes in which he or she is called to serve. That's what it demands. Now, according to the document I mentioned to you before, the basic norms for the formation of permanent deacons, I quote, you've heard this before, the deacon is called to proclaim the scriptures and instruct and exhort the people. And this is of major importance, because a deacon who is insufficiently educated cannot possibly instruct the people and cannot possibly, if I may quote 1 Peter, give a reason for the hope that is in him, or nowadays him or her. Give a reason for the hope that is in you. You can't do it unless you have some basic education. And one of the major problems faced, I think, by some, or indeed most of the Anglican churches in Canada, and somewhat less so by the Episcopalian Church in the United States, is that many vocational deacons are unequipped, and being honest here, unequipped either historically or theologically to address the questions that parishioners might put to them. But this is also true of some parish priests, is not here my concern. But I've spoken, alas, this is true. I have myself spoken with ordained clergy in Newfoundland and Labrador who were unaware, totally unaware, for example, of the content of the nature, the history, the content of the creeds, the essential creeds that they're actually reciting day after day and week after week. I know clergy who believe the Nicene Creed came from the Council of Nicaea. It did not. I know clergy who believe that the Apostles' Creed came from the Apostles. It did not. I know clergy who believe the Athanasian Creed was written by Athanasians. It was not. It just happens to be the truth. And so, for this reason, a number of parishes, in fact, both in Canada and the United States, have instituted compulsory programs for deacons, for vocational deacons, some longer, some shorter, designed to keep this deacon, designed to keep them acquainted with recent developments, with the most recent developments in biblical and historical and moral and liturgical theology. I'll give you one example. I mentioned to a couple of deacons just recently, have they ever heard of the so-called fragment of the Gospel of Jesus' wife? One of the only thing we have is the size of a business card, which actually in Coptic has Jesus referring to in Coptic Tahina, my wife. They haven't heard of it. They haven't heard of it. It happens to be, thank God, it happens to be a fake. It's a very skillful fake, but it is in fact a fake. But they didn't know about this. They should know about it. Because this is what parishioners are going to be reading. They're reading and get told, this is exciting stuff. So Jesus was married. I mean, as far as I know, I don't know whether he's married or not, quite honestly. But this seemed demonstrated. So we need a deacon. If someone comes up and says, so the parish says, was Jesus married? The deacon doesn't say, I have no idea what you're talking about. Say, well, this is interesting because this is this new document which has come up, etc., etc. They don't have to read Coptic to do it. They can get the stuff on the web, on Wikipedia, it's all there. And that's what you need to know. In other words, you have to be up to date with things. And there's no excuse not to be. In other words, these days you have to keep up with your parishioners. So this is important. It really is important. Actually, I mean, it reminds me of an Orthodox priest, an archpriest of mine. Archpriest is a good title. We really need those in the Anglican Church. It's the equivalent of Archdeacon, except it's for a priest. Be in a position for a long time. Anyway, an archpriest who, on one occasion, when one of his parishioners came up with a really thorny theological question about the perichoresis of the Trinity, John Damascus' doctrine of the perichoresis of the Trinity, this wretched man had been reading, of course, theology, which had been kept out of the hands of lay people at all costs. And he asked him this really tricky question, and he said to him, my business, in Russian, my business is to pray for your soul and drag you screaming and protesting into paradise. You have theological question, you ask my deacon. So, what do deacons do? The answer is whatever they need to do. That's the question. But there is something which they must do. It is generally agreed, both in the Roman Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition and the Anglican tradition, what they must do is, one, proclaim the gospel. The gospel book is yours, deacons. Whoever is there, even if the ecumenical patriarch and the Archbishop of Canterbury are there, the gospel book is yours. You read it and you keep it to yourself. You carry it in procession, and you may or carry it back or give it to the servant to carry it back. The gospel book is ours. We proclaim the gospel. 2, we prepare the holy table for the consecration of the elements. And 3, we give the dismissal when a dismissal is to be given. In BAS it is, in the BCP it is not. But the BCP, as you know, is a decidedly, radically Protestant piece of work. Now the things a deacon may do are, as you would expect, varied. He or she may preach. This has been challenged, but there's indisputable evidence for it from the early church. There's no question about it. Deacons preached. They may preach, therefore. They may lead the prayers of the people and the general confession. They may invite those present to share the sign at the peace. They may do that. They may turn the page of the altar book for the presider, should he or she wish it. They may elevate the chalice of doxology and of the invitation to communion. It's not, I think, generally done here in St. John's. I don't know all the churches, of course, certainly not done in the cathedral. I mentioned it to the former dean, Jyoti, who went white, went almost black in the face, was about to have a fit on the floor. I suggested this might be done. And the deacon will administer the chalice, may administer the chalice, and supervise or complete the ablutions. All these things which he or she may do. Customary place to the deacon is at the right hand presiding minister, and the presence of the deacon at the right hand of the presiding minister demonstrate that the liturgy does not belong to the presiding minister alone. It's a team effort. It's a team effort between priest and deacon. Vocational deacons may also lead morning prayer and evening prayer and midday prayer. They may conduct baptisms. They may conduct marriages once they're registered to do so with the provincial government, and they may bury people. They should, although they're not always invited, be at their bishop's side because they're still primarily responsible to the bishop and not to the presbyter. They should be at their bishop's side episcopal offices such as the blessing of oils, such as anointing, confirmations and ordinations. This is not usually done here. But the deacon's place is by the bishop with this. And they can, they don't always, they can play a major role in the liturgies of Holy Week and Easter. On Palm Sunday, for example, Palm Sunday, the deacon may read the Gospel of the Liturgy of the Psalms. On Good Friday, the deacon may lead the solemn intercession, and at the Easter Vigil, the deacon may carry the pastoral candle and sing the whole of the great exaltation. One piece of liturgy. In other words, vocational deacons may do considerably more, very much more, than most parish clergy think they can. And if they were allowed to do what in fact they can do, if we were allowed to do what we can do, it might make the life of the parish clergy considerably less demanding. In other words, you've got deacons, this is what we can do. Use it, but too many, at the moment, too many parish clergy do not know what deacons can do, and if they do know what deacons can do, they don't want to ask them because they think, once again, of the deacons creeping up behind them and trying to take over. We're not trying to take over. If we want to take over, we become priests. Deacons rule. And last of all, what is called the Office of Administration in the 1988 document. This is the deacon in the world. Okay, it's now recognized that, or it should be recognized, that the deacon, the heart of the diaconate lies in the Eucharist, just as the Eucharist lies at the heart of the church and, of course, of what the church is, namely the people of God. In the wider world, the deacon remains the bishop's agent, and the deacon, this is important, the deacon is a bridge builder, both inside and outside the ecclesia, the church community. In the world, the deacon has something of a Pauline prophetic role, where need exists, injustice is seen to exist, and he has responsibility to do what he or she can in bringing the church's the church's message of peace and justice to a war-torn and, as we know, unjust world. How? Directly or by facilitating the ministry of others. Depends on the circumstances, depends on the place, depends on the person, depends on the deacon, depends on the time. But, and this is important too, the deacon's business, and this is the unpleasant part, is also to bring to the church and to the bishop and to the priest the concerns of the world. And when the deacon is ordained, he or she is told by the bishop that, I quote, you are to interpret to the church the needs, concerns, and hopes of the world. One of my great friends in the States, the vocational deacon down there, said this is the most demanding passage of any, to interpret to the church the needs, concerns, and the hopes of the world. Now, the church and the bishop may not always be very happy to hear these concerns. That is beside the point. It is the deacon's duty to make them known. Things are not as they should be, if things are not going well, if things are being done in an un-Christian manner, and we see that happening, it is the business of the deacon to point it out. It's going to be an extremely uncomfortable half hour with the bishop or the priest, but it has to be done. It has to be done. That's our business. The needs of those in need are many and they vary. There are some who are lonely, there are some who are marginalized. There are some who are hungry, there are some who are sick, there are some with mental problems, there are some who are in dire poverty, there are some who are imprisoned, there are some in need of basic education, some in need of basic literacy, some despised, there are some rejected, there are some in shelters, and so on, and so on, and so on. And of course, it's impossible that any one deacon is going to be able to attend to the needs of all. And as Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 12, There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different kinds of service. What's the word for service? Deacon, diaconia. There are different kinds of deaconing, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of activities, but the same God who works all things in all people. The manifestation of the Spirit is given to each for the common good. So it's for each deacon, in consultation with his or her bishop, or with the incumbent and with the incumbent of the parish, to discern the gifts or talents they possess and how they may best be used for that common good of which the Apostle Paul speaks. But once again, and I stress this, it's important to emphasize, in some cases, any intervention is best left to those professional training. As I said before, amateur involvement, however well-meaning, in areas in which there are social or psychological problems, can be utterly disastrous. I make no apology for stating that twice. In short, the position of a deacon is, in fact, a far more important one, or should be a far more important one than most people think. True, as deacons, I suffer, of course, from the inherent laziness, which is a sort of natural feature of all human people, particularly males of my advanced age. I suffer from initial inertia. It's hard to get out of bed in the morning. It's hard to get started. And I really would like an easy life. I retired, for God's sake. And I shouldn't be here talking to you now. I should be down in Bermuda with something cold and clinky in a glass and a big fat stogie in my hand. Just idling my life away on a beach in the warm. And here I am instead, having these things thrust upon me, being at the tyrannical finger of provost, of having to do things for the bishop and for the church, writing papers like this, writing this and the other. And why? Because I took it upon myself to serve. Not in my case to serve as pastoral counsellor, that isn't my area, but to serve in the areas where I do have something to say. I serve my cats by cleaning out my kitchen litter. I serve my theological students by cleaning out the dross in their minds. And I put into those minds something of that essential theology, spirituality, and belief which the Church of England, with its devotion to Scripture, tradition, and reason, so eminently exemplifies. May God help us all to make progress, to move forward into broader, cleaner pastures. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. David, you stay there for a moment because there may be questions or comments. Shortly, I'm going to ask Bill Strong, the Archdeacon for Trinity Conception area, to share some of his thoughts and reflections on how Diaconate is run in this ministry in the area. But before that, we'll just say, first of all, if anyone online has a particular question or comment to David's presentation.
Yeah, you're not coming through well there, Rick.
What's up, Bill?
I said you're okay. Not coming directly to the microphone.
Okay, maybe I'm looking away a bit too far. Anyone, any questions or comments to David's presentation?
Is it okay if I speak? Yes.
Sure, Bill. Yeah.
Okay. I thank you very much for your... there's a few notes that I've noticed in my years in working with deacons, and one of the pleasant things that I really do, I have been blessed with deacons both in my last two parishes, and I agree it is as Dr. Bell says, and that very often deacons, we have underutilized deacons in many ways. But one of the things we have to understand is that there's been a transition from lay readers to deacons in our church, which is a very positive thing. And we have to remember there's been a subtle change over the years. It used to be that people being trained to be teachers would be assumed to become a lay reader, because very often going to remote communities, they would be called upon to do oversee funerals and burials and things of that nature. And now there's been some adjustment, because there's been a stepping back from that role, but also dovetailed with that and working with that, of course, has been the removal of our denominational education system. It used to be that when a teacher would be appointed to a place, he'd have to sort of warm up to the local clergy in order to look for work, because very often, if you ask some of the priests and deacons who I've worked with, who have a history of teaching, they first came to the church by making contact with the local priest to help find employment, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's just the way it was. And today we are blessed that deacons have made a bigger commitment in terms of their education. I think it is definitely a partnership, and I think that there's no logical reason for any priest to feel in any way threatened by a deacon, but the communication piece between the two individuals is so vital to the running of a parish. Of course, all our parishes and our faith operates on the whole idea of relationships. So our relationships with deacons are so important. And the other thing which I would like to think that we're missing out on as a church is the whole idea on how we see deacons. I always like the idea, and I liked your comment to say that the bridge between the church and the world. And I always felt that the deacon, a deacon's role is very much to bring the world to the church. But very often we get caught up in the service side, and especially in the rural areas, we don't have other than an immediate social conscience. We don't have a social conscience in the bigger sense of the word. We don't have people standing up for causes in the world. We have people who stand up for individuals, but we don't have people standing up for causes and stuff. But those are the important things, and the biggest plus, of course, is the educational component on both sides, because I've had to learn from the gifts of our deacons, and I'm sure that I very much appreciate their thirst for learning as well. That's really my comments.
Great, thank you very much, then, Bill.
Agreed on both counts, absolutely. I didn't have time to deal with it, a whole section in this report that I'm drawing up on the relationship between the lay ministry, the lay readership, and the diaconate, and the importance of the fact that the diaconate is an ordination and the lay readership is not in fact an ordination, and what that involves and what that entails. But there's no question that that is an area which needs delicate footwork. No question about it. No, lay readership, the lay ministry, the Eucharistic ministers are so vitally important, especially in smaller parishes. And boy, are we ever glad to have them.
Oh yes, big time.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, David. I'm going to ask you to come here to the podium as well, because it will make it easier for the audio and what have you. Or I can turn it to here, that way, and let you be seen.
Thank you.
Speak loud, and all will go well.
Well, I wanted to ask David one question before all this started. The handbook that was supposed to be written for the diaconate, it was a few years ago that a book was supposed to be written.
There was intended to be a book. It was underway. There were various drafts of it. It never came to anything, as far as I can tell, Emeline. I asked for a copy of it, but it was not forthcoming because I don't think there was any copy to be had. So what happened with that, it seems to have vanished away. And I was asked then to draw up a new scheme, a new position paper on the nature and functions of the vocational diaconate, which is in fact, of which this, what I said today, was a brief summary.
Mm-hmm.
But what there was intended to be that, but what happened to it, I don't know. Central Newfoundland has in fact a document on the diaconate,
Mm-hmm.
although it is, if I may be honest, it is now out of date.
Mm-hmm.
It's out of date. And that's what the purpose of this new one is. And that is, but this is still underway. It's still under development. And I will need some assistance with it. I say I will need some assistance with it.
I'd be glad to help, sir. Thank you.
Other comments?
Well, I've been an ordained deacon for 12 years, 14 years. And I've had different experiences. But for the most part, I found out that teamwork with the priests that I worked with was the best. And what I've been used to is Monday mornings having a meeting and a plan for the week. That's the way I've worked in the last few years. And being involved with all the meetings and the vestry meetings and everything that goes on. So I am in the know of what goes on. I've been very involved in pastoral work and visiting. And I've even been instrumental in helping a dear soul find her way into a nursing home. But then again, I have a nursing background, so that makes the difference. There's been many things in my life that's been so special.
It's been good experience, and that teamwork is so important.
Definitely, and I always take part in any education that's offered because we never learn enough.
Right. Yeah. Of course, you did a program here at College.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I did diploma in ministry and theology, and I also did the associate, and I started the bachelor, but didn't finish that. I was too busy in my parish.
Nothing at your heel. But anyway, great ministry, wonderful. The point you make about teamwork and using skills that you bring from your own background. I want to ask Father Paul Lundrigan, who's a Roman Catholic priest and pastor, to speak because there's Pope Francis has made interesting
Comments on a few things, but it's an interesting time, I think, for diaconate
in the Roman Catholic Church as well. And what David Bell has brought to us, of course, is missionary in the sense that it's applicable and lessons to be learned in all denominations. Paul, you're quite involved with initiatives in the Archdiocese. So I'll ask you for a few comments and observations.
Well, as David mentioned, the experience of the permanent diaconate in the Roman Catholic Church is far different than it is in the Anglican Communion. The idea of the permanent diaconate has taken off in the Catholic Church in various dioceses across Canada and the United States, and we have a lot of permanent deacons here now. It was brought up in the Archdiocese of St. John's a number of times. People had asked about it, and the various bishops have come forward with a proposal to do a program of preparation and to ordain permanent deacons, but it has never been accepted. It is accepted by some, but it was rejected by many, including myself, for years, and I'm still reticent to accept a permanent diaconate within our church because of misogyny that is so inherent in it. My experience of permanent diaconate, and I know a number of permanent deacons of our church in Ontario particularly, where I studied, and the men who prepared for the diaconate, most of all of the ones that I knew were married men, and they would come to the seminary where I studied with their wives. Their wives were expected to be with them, not only as a sign of support, but they would do the studies as well. And then when these men were ordained, they would put on a white alb, and so would their wives. and they'd come up in procession, and the men would go to one side, the women would go to another. The men would then be invested by their wives with the deacon stole and all this sort of thing after the ordination, and then they would remove their albs. And I thought the symbolism of that was horrible. Women were blocked from the same ministry that they could do as laypersons. Because within our church, and I'm not too sure how the structure works within the Anglican church, but what you pointed out about the sort of conflict between the ministry of deacons and of lay readers, we also have in our church that laymen and lay women can do the exact same function as a permanent deacon through delegation by a bishop. They can baptize, they can preside at weddings and at funerals without Eucharist. They can preside at morning prayer, evening prayer. They can do all the functions that a deacon would do, except they're not ordained to it. So we've had a lot of objection that if we start ordaining men to the permanent diaconate, it will eliminate the ministry of so many women who right now make up about 85–90% of our congregations and our ministry within our churches. Another problem that we saw, and I don't mean to be tearing down the permanent diaconate, but these are problems that we have to address and I think need to be grappled with, was what you pointed out. It is not a permanent diaconate. It is a vocational one. And again, the misogyny came through that I knew, well, you could say a dozen, but there's about 20 or 30 guys that I know, oddly enough, who are ordained as permanent deacons, and their wives died. And as soon as their wives died, suddenly they had a vocation to priesthood. And it wasn't within a matter of a few years later. It was in a matter of months after the death of their wives. They would come back in to do an upgrade in their training. And when I was still at seminary, I knew a guy who came in after his wife died for 6 weeks, one night a week for an hour, with a retired priest who was in his 80s. And after about 15 minutes, poor old Father Moss would fall asleep. This guy would give him a good 25–30-minute nap, then wake him up and say, "Oh, that was great, Father, thank you very much." That was his upgrading in theology. 7 weeks later, he was ordained as a priest. It demonstrated to a lot of people, a lot of wives of deacons, because we knew them where they come to the seminary, a number of them banded together and said, "I am your wife, not your impediment. And if I should die ahead of you, you are a permanent deacon." And there wasn't many of them, but there were a few of them who made that point, and it came home to me that if we are to have a permanent or even a vocational diaconate, it must be treated as such. And if you are going to go on to priesthood, there has to be a better reason than my impediment is no longer alive. Also, within our church, a married man can become ordained as a deacon. But if his wife dies, even if he doesn't go on to become a priest, he must remain celibate. And I really don't understand that at all, because even though he's part of the Latin rite, if he could be ordained as a married man, he should be able to be married afterwards. I know it goes back to a more ancient tradition that we've seen in the Eastern Church, but it is, again, a form of misogyny that says, well, you're better off without a woman attached to you if you're going to serve in the church. So for those reasons, we tended to stay clear of diaconate. However, going back to Rick's point, we have a new guy in Rome. And he has been constantly surprising me because he has not yet disappointed me. He has not done everything that, a lot of people would like him to do. He has not overturned past teachings that came from just the most recent popes that said, women, we do not have the authority at all to ordain women. But without disrupting the whole church by saying we can't ordain women, he said, no, we're not going to touch that. But he recently, this summer, he invited people to come forward to talk about the idea of women being ordained as deacons, and that there's great evidence in the early church that women served as deacons. Phoebe, as you mentioned.
That's right.
We have a right for the ordination of, and it's an ordination form, not a setting aside. Normal ordination.
Exactly.
And they know when they're Archdeacon at the sessions of the church.
So the Pope is now saying, let's do a study on that and make a recommendation. He knows the study's been done. We have the evidence. So it's very encouraging for us that if the permanent diaconate or vocational diaconate, I think that's a much better word, if it could be opened up to women and we could rid ourselves of the misogyny, it would make it so much more palatable within our congregations that this is a service that can be given by the people. Now, there are some who would say that it is just a creeping clericalism within the church. And the same sort of problem that you were talking about, Bill mentioned about the clash between deacons and lay readers, whatever. But I don't think that the order of deacons and their role within the church would necessarily negate the role of the laity, which was a huge thing in the Second Vatican Council. You know, the role of the laity in the church and an emerging role of the lay apostolate. I think each are of, great value to the church. So it depends upon how the church explores the possibility of broadening the view of service of men and women in the church as lay people and men and women ordained to the permanent diaconate. I'd be very excited about exploring the possibilities of that. But those are the problems, some of the obstacles that we're still experiencing. But it's a wonderful time, as the Chinese proverb says, to be living in such interesting times. Anyway, thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Emeline. Thank you, Bill. What I'm going to do now is ask people who are in this room anything from their own experience to bring to our forum today. Please come here so that those online will be able to hear you. And I will ask that right now if anyone online has any more questions.
Sorry, can I hear you? Okay, anyone online have any questions or comments or observations to bring to the forum right now? And I've asked that people here in this room come up here to the podium so that they can be seen and heard by those online. Anyone online with a comment or observation? Anything from your own experience in ministry or in as a member of the church generally?
I just add that I think it's important for parish priests to reach out to lay readers to make sure that they are included in the life of the parish. And I'm not blessed with lay readers right now in my present parish, but I know that it has often been a question, and I think it's a challenge for our diocese as well, where we once had a very active lay reading association for education and development and so on. As I agree with everything that has been said, that is not something that we don't have to be in competition with each other at all.
Great, thank you, Bill. Anyone else with any comments or observations to bring to the forum? Carmel, come here and bring yours. You introduce yourselves. Will you have comments to make, either if you're online or if you're here in this room?
Carmel Doyle, and I teach here at the college, have for a long time. And one of the things that you talked about experience, and I'm going to link this experience to the word that David has chosen to ask us to consider renaming the permanent diaconate as vocational diaconate. I think that if we name something a vocational diaconate, which I think is a wonderful term, then we have to start seeing it as such and recognizing the fact that it's not necessarily that one day somebody wakes up and says, well, I've been a lay reader for X number of years and I'm retired now and I don't want to sit home, so I think I'm going to be a deacon. And the fact of the matter is that the call to diaconate is the same call, in a sense, in the mechanism that it arises and needs to be fostered, as is the call to priesthood. And one of the things that brought this home to myself and Reverend Joanne Mercer, who's out in Central right now, was a number of years ago, there had been no particular work done for discernment of vocations in any of the dioceses. So we felt, well, let's see if we can get some people together, people who might be discerning vocation. So Joanne and I sat over in an office and looked at one another and says, okay, we'll first speak to the 3 bishops, ask if it's all right with them if we can do this. So we got that okay. Then we looked at one another and said, well, how many people do we think we'll need to be able to run this? And we looked at one another and said, you know, if we get 4 or 5, it'd be worth running. And we thought 4 or 5 out of the, across the 3 dioceses would be the number of people we would get. So we went ahead and planned and organized and got St. Catherine's out in Central. And we were absolutely astounded that 17 people, once the call for discernment of vocation, and that was the way it went out, discernment of vocation was offered. We, because we had been always thinking in terms of what we've done and how we've done it, we're still thinking vocation to priesthood. So when we prepared our weekend, our Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we were preparing for people for discerning for priesthood. Sort of on the last tail of it, going out of here on Friday morning, as we were driving to St. John's, we took the, I can't think of the word, not competencies, but the descriptions of the different calls that the Anglican Church of Canada has put out for baptized people, for lay readers, for deacons, for priests, and the things that were expected. We took it as an afterthought as we were going through the door. So come Saturday, we did Friday night and Saturday, all that we had thought, and I had copies made of this and said to you know, people, take a look at this tonight and just see, you know, given what it is the church is asking, where you feel God is calling, because all of these people were really in discernment mode. Well, I don't know what happened Saturday night, but when they came down Sunday morning before Eucharist, and we'd had morning prayer, and then we had some open discussion, it was clear of the 17 people that of the 17, 14 felt strong call to diaconate, 3 to priesthood. And the fact of the matter is I think that one of the things you said that the church has a hard time with prophets. Well, the church has an even harder time with the Spirit of God. A much harder time with the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God is alive, well, and active. And if we want to start to see as church where we need to go, we need to tune in to that channel. If the Spirit of God is calling so many people to service in their local area as deacons, and we are at the same time facing what we call a lack of clergy, it really doesn't take a whole lot to draw the line from one to the other, but to do justice to the individuals who are called, as well as to do justice to the church, to ensure that those who are called are given the supports they need, both spiritual and educational, and I'm going to say in terms of payment for service. If you don't do that, you are doing a disservice to the church. And I think when we do a disservice to the church, we do a disservice to the gospel and its proclamation and its living, bringing us to live into the kingdom. So I think that we really need to do some more work around discernment, vocational awareness, and then once that has occurred, do the same kind of a process that we would do for anyone who is going to go into ministry as a part of who they are and their life commitment, whether they be priests or bishops or deacons or anyone else. But I really think that it's very, very clear. You know, as I said, you don't have to do an awful lot. And you can see, once people know, they know what's going on in their hearts. They feel called. The only thing is they don't necessarily see themselves as priests, but they know they have a strong call more than what they're doing on a volunteer basis, which keeps them not just at arm's length, it keeps them sort of over in the next county from being part of the life of the organized church. So I think that we really need to look at that whole notion. So that means that for priests and for bishops, I think there's work to be done. There's big work to be done in the whole area of discernment. There's work to be done in vocational awareness. And then from there, there are ways to do things. We have educational institutions, Queen's College being one of them. We have dioceses who are willing to undertake training. We can plug into national and even international spaces. But I really think I think the vocational piece is key. If God's Spirit is working in these people's hearts, calling them, who are we to block it? So that's my comment.
Thank you, Carmel, and good comments there. Thank you. Any others? Any comments from here? Those who are here, come forward. While coming for your comments, I'll just share one tidbit I came across recently, and I think it is interesting in the discussions today. The comments from our panelists and from David remind us so much about the context of diaconal ministry within the church, and that it can't be just hit and miss or in an unorganized way. One of the interesting things is that there's some studies that are showing that when a church has a deacon who is qualified and competent to do what needs to be done in that congregation, that it actually enhances the amount of participation from lay people, that it isn't taking tasks away or impeding what lay people would do, but there is more lay involvement because of it. We actually found the same thing in my role in Eastern Health when we would hire people in positions to deliver pastoral care. We found, and we tracked it out over the years that I was there, many, but for every position that we paid for every hour we paid for on our Eastern Health budget, we got 6 hours, at least 6 hours, and it, in fact in the latter years increased up to 8 and 9, but we were getting 6 hours back from people who were qualified and competent to offer professional pastoral care, or chaplains and what have you, that the amount of work that was being done by those increased for every position we had. Why is that? Because when you have a competent, qualified person on your staff to organize programs, then people who want to participate will come forward with their gifts and abilities to fit in the structures and processes that you have in place. But to many, it is overwhelming to say, yes, I'd like to get involved, but I don't know where to begin, I don't know what to get involved at, and I don't know what people will understand to be my competencies or my limitations, and in fact, how do I go about actually visiting the sick or intervening with those who need whatever it is that I can bring, including support in their times of loneliness and what have you. Anyway, David Burrows, good to have you.
David Burrows, Parish of the Ascension in Mount Pearl. Been ordained as deacon for 16 years, as priest for a little less. Dr. Bell, I appreciate your history, and I wanted to request perhaps in your revision and continued accompaniment of and discussion on the topic that you bring up the presence of deaconesses in the order of in the Anglican tradition, and also the role of the ordination of women in their development of the diaconate. I think particularly in the Church of England, the place of deacon was enhanced because women were unable to be ordained as priests. And so, okay, thank you. Yeah.
And the change from what had deaconess in the 1900s and then separated out. I'll ask you to come forward. I certainly want more point to the question of ordination.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that was one inadequacy that I would hope that you could rectify. Thank you. The challenge I think that I see is, again, that has been discussed in various ways, is the place of lay ministry and of lay readers in the Anglican context, particularly in this province and in this diocese, but also the role of priest, of deacon, and of the baptized within faith communities. And we're kind of getting into those places. Like one of the comments you made, I was actually offended by, which was the comment around the Eucharist being the place of both the priest and the deacon. I would say the Eucharist is the place of both the priest, the deacon, and the baptized. And I think we need to keep this piece in the whole process. And this is a challenge, I guess, that has come to me and as a part of the changing flux of what the Anglican Church of Canada is. To give you an example, when I entered into training in ministry, the conversation that was happening in the diocese where I served as a layperson was around what they call the perpetual diaconate at the time, and then concerns around the ordination to the diaconate and possible lessening of the role of laity within the diocese. I went away to theological college, and two things happened. One thing was that the Anglican Church of Canada got into a bit of a issue with regards to finances around the whole residential school piece, and whether or not there were aspects of the dioceses that could be solvent. And the second point was that the perpetual diaconate and the vocational diaconate was on the table in a different way and was much more developed. So I came back after 3 years at Queen's College with a few professors that I note around here to find that there was an enhanced level of diaconate within the diocese in which I served, and yet there was not necessarily a correlation of learning and of development of vocation in each of the ways. I find on a daily basis, I live out my diaconal ministry a lot more than I live out my priestly ministry. And I think that is a part of who I am. And so I guess this conversation around vocational diaconate brings into into question, also into challenge, the perspective of the transitional diaconate within the Anglican tradition. And I know that a certain retired dean of my parish has specific views on that as well. So those are the challenges that I offer.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much, David. I don't know, and David Bell. We have two Davids. Wonder if you have any particular comment on the anything that David Burrows had. And I'll ask you specifically, if you'd come even here to respond to it, is the term deaconess current, or is it kind of not used as much?
No, deacon
Sorry, can't hear you, please.
Phoebe, who is a deacon in the New Testament, is not called a deaconess because the word doesn't exist. Deaconesses did come. The term deaconess came into prominence, especially in about the 1890s and the 1910s, 20s, when the first deaconesses, they weren't the first in the church, but the first deaconesses were consecrated or blessed, more precisely, in the Church of England. This is a long and moderately complicated story, which I deal with elsewhere. But the deaconesses as a set-aside group of women, in fact, faded away, and then the whole question with the ordination of women came up, which offered, of course, to women full ordination, which previously had been taken over by the possibility of being set aside as a deaconess. So that once we had the possibility of the ordination of women, the idea of the deaconess and the term deaconess tended to be removed. So nowadays we don't hear very much about it. We occasionally hear about it in the Orthodox Church, where the term deaconess, I mean, I'm not talking about in the Russian or Greek, but the term deaconess is occasionally used in the Orthodox Church in America, for example, because in the Orthodox Church, they have in fact brought back a female diaconate within very limited areas. The only time you'll see female deacons, ordained female deacons, not set aside, that's the important thing, are in some of the very large women's monasteries. They don't appear in parochial work, and they don't appear outside that particular area. But they do have female deacons, and occasionally they're called deaconesses. But in the Anglican tradition, deaconess is now not a term which is used, and deacon is a term which is used quite properly, as it was used in the New Testament, for both female and male, or in these days, all the various indeterminate in-between stages too. As far as David's comment goes on the laity, I couldn't agree more. There's a whole area which I have in the document which I'm drawing up, which is dependent to a large extent on the excellent constitution on the laity from the Second Vatican Council, which brings in the whole question of the church as the people of God, that essential feature of the church as the people of God, and looks very carefully at what the role of the related role of priest and deacon and baptized lay ministry is, whether not the Lutheran idea of the priesthood of all believers, but certainly the baptized ministry as against the ordained ministry, because this too is really significant in understanding what the diaconate is, what the vocational diaconate is, and what its demands are. So that, in fact, is something which I deal with in some detail in the document which I'm in the process of drawing up. I appreciate the comments of all of you, I really do.
Right. Thank you, David. We'll see if there are any other comments. Holly, you have one here. In the meantime, I'll ask if anyone else online has a comment or observation.
Just to underline what David was saying, that I think it was always important that was always understood in my training that you never stop being a deacon, and that even though, you know, I've been ordained a priest, it doesn't mean that you stop being a deacon. And I think we have to learn from that office all the time.
Right. We have Holly here.
I'm Holly Lockyer. I'm doing the Master of Divinity program here at Queen's College. A very quick comment. I have had the great fortune of being in a parish where there was an excellent deacon who was adequately empowered. He was the backbone of our parish, and I can honestly say at times when we were without an ordained minister, he kept the parish running, and we were I shouldn't say we were no less off for it, because we do need the ordained, but we had that foundation, we had that support, you know, and when it works well, it works really, really well. So I'm very fortunate to have that background. But now I may have to pay a toonie to our dean for not knowing the answer to my own question. Can you explain the role of the catechist? Or is that another session altogether? Okay, good enough. Sometimes tell me.
Holly, just before you go, you were making the point, and it's great, and thanks for sharing with us the experience you have from Parish, where you had, as you said, a capable and competent and I suppose empowered deacon. Because the deacon is ordained. You mean when your parish was without a pastor?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. And it is, and that shows the continuity of the people of God, and that it is the faith community that continues, not just the role and ministry of the pastor, and it all take down your tent and move on and start from scratch. Thank you, Holly, very, very much. Neil, do you have a comment? These are great comments, folks, and David has said that the question on catechist needs to be answered in another session, so we'll book you, David.
Neil Kellett, presently the chaplain here at Queen's. I've had the good fortune in ministry of working first and foremostly with lay readers who have delivered ministry in a particular way that I found here in Newfoundland when I emigrated here over 40 years ago. I've also had the opportunity to work with one of the few worker priests which we had in Newfoundland as well. And then I had the good fortune to be able to work with a deacon. One of the things which spoke very forcefully to me today was the last comment that Dr. Bell made about the deacon bringing the needs of the world. Because indeed, all these three groups of people sought to do that and did it very successfully. And I was always eternally grateful to each of them when they felt they were able to express feelings that were current in the parish, which either people were positive about or felt that further change needed to be made. And the other thing which I think, also going back to Dr. Bell's earlier point about possibly a better term is vocational, a vocational diaconate, is the fact that we all need always to remember that we are in a part of the kingdom for a relatively short space of time. Lay readers, worker priests, and deacons are there for a much longer period of time, usually, and can interpret the needs of that community highly successfully and often better than the incoming temporary, as it were, 5, 7-year, 10-year priest. I just think we need to remember that fact. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Neil. Great comments and observations. Anyone else in this room have any comment or question? Anyone online with anything to add? Okay, well, just to wrap up, thank you all. Thank you who are here. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Bell, Dean of Theology at Queen's College, for all you do for us. Today's session was a great example. I hope those who are visiting us today here on site and those who are online can get a sense of some of what we do and the quality of what we do at Queen's. We will be doing more of this as well, reaching out into the beyond Prince Philip Drive. We've been doing it and had good success in response on these continuing education sessions. We have a few more lined up, one in October on suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention, as it's called. In November, we're going to do a session on coping with the holidays as a kind of a resource session for congregations who might want to do something prior to or during the Christmas season. And in December, we'll have a session on clergy wellness. We have lots of other topics in the hopper as well, and I hope before the fall is over to have the Reverend Dr. Canon Frank Clewett repeat his session on Queen's College in the 3 tenses, past, present, and future. And that'll be a great session. And part of it is that we are actually in this term now, the term when the 175th anniversary is actual in counting. It would have started in the fall semester, so be a good time for us to have an event. And so we'll let you know about that. We want to record that event. Frank has done a lot on the history of it, and so we hope to video record it so it's online and available for those who would need it or want it. We have lots of other sessions and things to talk about in the future, and so you'll be hearing from us. But in the meantime, thank you all for attending. Especially thank you, Emeline. Thank you, Bill Strong. Thank you, Paul, for being with us, bringing the interesting perspectives that only experience can bring, and bringing also the breadth and the challenges that we have in church, within Christianity, within
various denominations and within congregations as well. But anyway, thank you all. We'll be putting this video online for those who want to view it. So if you've attended today and you want to tell others about it, you can also tell them to go on to the Queen's College website, and by tomorrow it should be there as a link. Thank you all and have a good day. Those who are here are welcome to stay with us for Eucharist at noon.
Thank you so much.
Great, thanks again.